Joe, welcome to the Interviewist. Thanks so much for joining me. Just to give you a brief little bragging session, read through your bio. Joe is an editorial leader and journalist based in Chicago. He has bylines under his belt at places like Village Voice, Huff Post, Windy City Times, and Chicagoist on topics ranging from politics to public health and culture. During his time recently as editorial director at Thrillist, Joe helped launch the Thrillist Itineraries destination guides. He helped relaunch the Next Flight Out newsletter, and he guided several other projects for Thrillist's global team. He also runs the Queering the Burbs newsletter and zine, which features personal essays and interviews that explore queerness in the Western Chicago suburbs. And as a fun fact, when I was digging through your bio, you previously co-hosted a pop culture podcast called Coffee and Bars.
Mhm.
First question, was Coffee and Bars at coffee shops and bars, or was it just tangentially related?
So that was a podcast I did with my best friend who lives in Portland, Oregon, and the Coffee and Bars line and title kind of came from our favorite movie, which is Drop Dead Gorgeous.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of a cult classic comedy from 1999, and Kirstie Alley's character in that movie, R.I.P., says something about help yourself to some coffee and bars, and so it's just kind of like creating this vibe of midwestern friendliness. The movie is about a fictional Minnesota beauty pageant, and
Mhm.
Kirstie Alley plays the leader of the beauty pageant, the host, and highly recommend it. It's got a great cast, but yeah, that was kind of our little shtick for a while. Please don't look it up because the audio, the audio editing, which I was responsible for, not great. So
A learning project, it sounds like.
yeah, but it was a lot of fun. Highly recommend making a podcast with your long distance bestie at some point.
I love it. I love it. That sounds great. And you got to get those Midwestern vibes out there. We need more Midwest representation. So everyone should add that
Always.
movie to the list.
Yeah.
Well, getting back on track within minutes, let's start with my very first question I've been asking everyone, but just kind of to give people context, um, for what your day-to-day looks like now or just even recently. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're involved with interviewing these days?
Yeah, so well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I love interviewing. I always have, even when it terrified me so much when I was starting out my career. But I love talking about it. Talking about talking. Um, you know, I'm I think I'm a yapper, just like in my blood. I remember my growing up, my dad would he worked in the agriculture industry and he'd always be visiting farmers. I'd be stuck in the truck bed, just like or the truck cab, not the bed, but I'd just be sitting there for hours as he was just like, yapping away with these farmers. And I think I come by it naturally. So um interviewing has always been a part of my life and my career. I knew I would want to be a journalist from a very early age, and I always knew the interview was kind of like core to that career and also core to a lot of similar careers in marketing and PR.
Mhm.
All of that interviewing comes in. And so, my most recent job at Thrillist, I would always work with my team when they were preparing for interviews with bigger names, Martha Stewart, Pete Buttigieg, so many folks. I personally interviewed Phaedra Parks of the Traders fame.
Love it.
It's always intimidating getting on the phone or getting on a Zoom call, especially with a known public figure. So I would always help coach my team and just, they would show me their list of questions they were thinking about, how they were going to structure the conversation, and I would kind of help guide them on if there were any questions that were missing. Just kind of thinking ahead to what do you want the headline to be, or what do you want actually out of this? What would you ideally want the story or whatever the end product to look like?
Mhm.
Making sure you have the questions that will likely get you there. Um,
Hmm.
so that was my gig at Thrillist. A lot of doing that, and a few times I would, the Phaedra one, I kind of made happen myself and jumped in myself because,
One
uh,
of the perks of being editor.
yeah, I'll take this one for the team. Don't worry. She was such a delight. Um, Told me about her. She was so generous with her time, and maybe this is a little, I mean, not TMI for me, but for her, I'm like, why are you telling me this? She's like, oh, take as long as you want. I have a colonoscopy tomorrow, so I'm just home chatting with you, and we were on the phone for about an hour. So, um,
Amazing.
yeah, but also, right now I'm really focused on obviously landing a job as my time with Thrillist
Yeah.
is done. But also, I've been working on queering the burbs and doing a lot of interviews with local activists and artists in the queer community where I live. And that's kind of a central pillar of this project. And most recently, I interviewed an 18-year-old real life Gen Z person. Tell me about that. What is it like through those young Gen Z eyes? So yeah, it's interesting, talking to everyone from a recent high school graduate to reality star royalty.
Mhm.
But the same principles I think always apply, and it's always fun to coach folks on those principles and take what I've learned over the years and help them through that. And also, continue to do it myself and brush up on my skills too.
Totally. I'm curious about w- at the beginning you said that when you first started interviewing, you would be low-key terrified. And I totally relate to that because when I started, I was also like, this is the worst thing. And do you still feel a little terrified? And does that help or hinder you? Or are you just totally unfazed at this point in your career by conducting interviews?
I think you're always a little bit nervous, even if you're not talking to a celebrity, but no one wants to come across as, for me, I never want to come across as unprepared or asking the dumb question or
Yeah.
um, just coming across, disrespectful in any way, especially when you're speaking with someone about vulnerable topics sometimes, which, that does come up on my newsletter and zine quite a bit.
Hmm.
So it's still scary every time a little bit, but I think it's like anything else. If it wasn't at least a little bit scary, it would be boring, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and you're excited about it, and you're hoping it will go well. So that's where some of the nerves come from. So,
Hmm.
but certainly I've gotten a lot less nervous than I used to be. I remember the first for a while I was interviewing at the beginning of my career back in like 2008, 2009. I was interviewing a lot of musicians who'd be coming through town for shows, and
Cool.
part of it was a ploy to get free concert tickets, let's be honest, and
Gotta
just
do what you
talk
gotta
to,
do. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, 2009, speaking of tough economic times, not the best economy to graduate into. I interviewed this artist named Rachel Yamagata. She was one of my first like national touring musician artists I interviewed, and I just remember I was on the phone. I was nervous. I was probably just sweating so much. Thankfully, it wasn't Zoom because that wasn't as popular or common back then. But I just remember my roommate's cat kept jumping on my lap.
Ah,
And so I'd be like, yeah, yeah, and like trying to pull a cat off of myself
oh
and
my gosh.
trying to make sure they didn't, get all over the keyboard and ruin my notes. And at one point, I just had to say, I'm so sorry, a cat is literally attacking me right now. And then we had a little side conversation about cats, which, I think sometimes just leaning into the inherent awkwardness and just being
Hmm.
real, not pretending that it's not strange sometimes, especially in that context of, you know, you don't know this person, they don't know you. You're sometimes asking sort of personal questions. The whole thing is a little weird. So I
Right.
think that was something I learned right away is that we're all human, and they're probably a little nervous too, even if
Hmm.
they've done a million interviews. No one wants to come across as dumb, especially when they're being, recorded by a journalist
Right.
for something that'll be published for the world to read. We're all kind of in the same boat.
Hmm. I feel like that's the most common refrain I hear from people when doing interviews at the beginning is like, just don't make me sound dumb. Make me sound smart, please. It's like the universal fear.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
you kind of hit on this a little bit, I think, but can you tell me what your approach to interviewing is or how you would describe your style? It sounds like you do a lot of research and preparation, but talk me through what that looks like a little bit.
I always do a lot of research, probably too much sometimes. It's like, um, but I don't know. I try to read as much as I can, especially if it's someone who's been interviewed a lot.
Yeah.
Um, Try to just see what's already out there and what are the questions that they're constantly being asked, because those are ones that if I can get away with it for the context of the piece, I will try and avoid.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm always trying to find, what are the questions that come to mind for me? Maybe it's like the follow up question that another journalist didn't ask or another media professional. What curiosities come to me by looking at, most recently published pieces. I also look all over their social media, if they have a blog, if they have a Twitter, their Instagram. Sometimes it's, journalists are creeps. Let's be honest here. We're professional creeps, so we're digging through those Google results. We're trying to find, um, trying just to find those juicy nuggets that maybe they haven't been asked about. And I think about every interview as a challenge to um, make it interesting for the readers, of course, but also make it interesting for myself and the person I'm
Hmm.
talking to.
Hmm.
Um, there's no better feeling when you're doing an interview with, especially some celebrity who's been interviewed a million times, to say, "Oh, I've never actually been asked that," or "I love that question." You know,
Yes.
and you're
Hmm.
like, pat yourself on the back moment. Um, yeah, I do too much research, to be honest. You're on hour 3 or 4, you're finally like, okay, I'm good. Like, just shut the laptop, stop going to your phone. You've got enough pages of notes, and then at that point, I'll start writing questions.
Hmm.
And Um, I try to go in very prepared with a list of questions that I think will flow naturally. Um, I start with easier ones just to kind of like ease into it as you're getting to know the person and trying to get that vibe. And then if
Yeah.
there's a question that I feel at all might be something they don't want to answer or something slightly contentious, I'll usually leave that toward the end. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so I'm someone who does like going in with pretty detailed notes and a pretty detailed list of questions. Um, that said, I try not to get too wed to that list where I'm just on to the next question every time versus if there's something that comes up or something to dig into or, you know,
Hmm.
always try to kind of leave that space and leave that ability to veer when needed. Um,
Totally.
it can be hard sometimes, especially interviewing celebrities. A lot of times you'll have a very limited time window. They'll be like, okay, you
Hmm.
need 10 minutes, which I've made that work before. It's not fun.
Yeah.
In that case, you
Oh my
kind of
gosh.
have to just go through your essential questions. But especially when you have a little more time, it's nice to be able to veer and kind of go in and out of your list that you had going in.
Totally. I feel like I need 10 minutes in each interview just to like get my nervous chatter out and like make
Yeah.
everyone comfortable. I would get none of my productive questions across. Um, that leads nicely into one thing I wanted to ask you about, which is you have a somewhat diverse experience because you've written like travel pieces for Thrillist, you've interviewed celebrities, you've done personal essay, podcasts, all kind of different formats and a lot of different topics. So, Do you change your approach to those interviews? Like, are you interviewing Phaedra in the same way you're interviewing the 18-year-old, or do you keep it same across the board and kind of why for whatever you say?
I think the fundamentals still apply no matter who you're talking to. It's still a
Hmm.
conversation you're just having with another person. You know, and you have this, you probably have something in mind that's shared of um, what is kind of the main subject of conversation. In the case of the 18-year-old, they actually had a new zine coming out. They were inspired by mine, which was really
Oh,
sweet to hear.
that's so cool.
Yes, more zines, more people. We need more people just writing about their experiences and sharing them with the world in general. But that was great to hear. But in the case of Phaedra, you know, obviously she wants to get a little nod to some of the stuff she has going on. So
Hmm.
um, I think it's always just keeping in mind that there are priorities that both sides of the conversation have, and keeping those top of mind. So, of course, it'll vary depending on who you're talking to and what the context is. But um, I mean, and also it also depends if you're like an investigative reporter, maybe you just don't even care as much what that the person you're interviewing what their goals are. You know, and then that case you're serving your reader.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, you're just thinking about, you know, what is everyone's priority? What's everyone's mission? Do I care? In the
Hmm.
case of that more investigative vibe. Um, or are you going to ask a few more questions that maybe they don't want to answer? So it'll vary depending on, you know, what type of thing you are writing, who the person is, what their priorities are, what your priorities are. But I think fundamentally, it's about those questions you're asking yourself when you're before you pick up the phone or join the Zoom link,
Hmm.
and just making sure that you have that in mind as you go through the conversation,
Right.
to not get pulled fully off track. Because when that happens, it's one of those interviews where it's everyone's nightmare. You look at your notes afterward and you say, "I don't have anything." I, I don't have what I needed. I can't write the piece.
Yes.
Or, and you know, that's in my case, that's been a pretty rare thing, but it does happen from time to time. And then in that case, it's just like, can we do a redo?
Hmm.
Or it's just like the piece isn't going to happen. So you want to avoid that. So that's why you have to keep that in mind, as you're going about it.
Yeah. And I think that ties back to what you said earlier about like keeping your purpose in mind and knowing what it is when you're going in. Because that is truly the nightmare of being like, I just spoke with this person for 45 minutes and I don't know what to show for it.
Yeah, I had a musician once I interviewed, and I think it was pretty clear they were just in a terrible mood.
Oof.
And we talked for about 20 minutes, and it was just like a lot of one word responses and
Oh no.
um, just like barely acknowledging the question. So I had to have the awkward conversation with the publicist to say, hey, didn't go so great. Um, would it be if we still want this piece to happen? I need to have another conversation. And then they put
Hmm.
me with a different member of the band, who was the singer's husband. So I don't know what
Oh,
that dynamic was, and that conversation went much better.
yeah.
Um, and you never know; people have bad days. Maybe I wasn't on my game, but we still made the piece happen. um, just a little awkwardness in between.
Yeah. Do you have any like tips or tricks? Because, like you said, sometimes even the loveliest people just have bad days. You don't always know what's going on. Like, if you're in one of those tough interview situations where you're getting those one word answers, or it's just like, you're like, oh my gosh, this is rapidly spiraling and going south. Like, do you have any practices or techniques you try and deploy to get things back on track?
Well, one of the things I do now always, especially if it's not like I'm working with a handler and they're a celebrity or something like that, I always start by asking, you know, is this still a good time to talk? Is this still, you know,
Hmm.
are we good?
Yeah.
Basically. giving them the out if, like, for whatever reason it's not a good day. Maybe the time doesn't work, maybe your kid is sick, or something else came up. Giving them the out, just say, no, this isn't actually the best time, can we reschedule? um,
Yeah.
so I always offer that, if it's not like if it wasn't a difficult to schedule kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I would say if I had been in that situation now, maybe 15 years later, um, maybe I would stop the interview and just say, hey, it kind of seems, is there a better time for us to continue this?
Hmm.
Or just saying, like, hey, I need a little more, especially if you feel like it's a situation where you have that shared, um, in the case of a band promoting a tour or an album, in
Right.
theory, they should want it to be a good piece too. So just being
Right.
like transparent and saying, hey, this isn't going great. Like,
Yeah.
can we do a different time? Or, you know, giving them an out in that case, instead of wasting everyone's time.
Yeah.
Um, I haven't done that, but it's maybe something I would try in that situation now.
Yeah.
Just cut it as short as possible. Say that clearly this isn't working. Like,
Yeah. I mean, it
uh,
sounds like a great tip. It's kind of like a graceful, like, I'll give you a little grace. We both know we want something from this. So, like, I'll give you the space if you need it, but you've got to tell me. Like,
yeah, yeah. I mean, I I'm sure in the case of like a touring musician specifically, that's not an easy life. And a lot of people getting interviewed, they're being interviewed because they're doing something interesting, and they
hmm.
probably have a lot on their plate. So it might not
Right.
always be the right time, might not be the best circumstance when you just happen to get them on the phone. So I think just having that transparency and checking in, again, realizing that we're all humans and things come up, and
Yeah. Totally.
offering that check in.
Yeah. Totally fair. Um, I'd like to pivot a little bit because I don't want to run out of time with talking about queering the burbs, which is such a cool project. It started as a newsletter, and then it sounds like you decided to also turn it into a zine, physical print copy. Um, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like a pretty personal project for you. So, do you feel like the kind of personal nature of the project impacts your approach to conducting interviews for it in any way?
Yeah, I mean, so the project started in 2020, peak COVID days. I think a lot of people were, some people made bread, other people got into puzzles. I made a newsletter. Um, I didn't really know what it was going to be at that time, but
Mhm.
um, I knew that at some point I'd want interviewing to be a big part of it, and mixing the interviews with other people, and um, also personal essays. And I think um, something that's come up a lot in the interviews I've done for that project is that, I feel like when you're asking folks to speak about something as personal as their journey through queerness or journey through self-discovery, and past possibly traumatic experiences, or even present
Mhm.
traumatic experiences, I feel like you're asking a lot of someone to put themselves out there.
Mhm.
So I always feel that I need to bring that energy too. It's not fair to
Mhm.
say, you have to go the mile and I'm just going to sit on the sideline and not
Right.
share anything personally about me. So in the conversations I have for the zine and for the newsletter, I'm often drawing parallels between what they're saying.
Mhm.
And if there's something I relate to, just bringing my own personal experience into it as well, and making it more of a shared conversation than this person's asking all the questions, the other person's answering all the answers.
Yeah.
So I think I do bring more into it than if I was, say, interviewing a public figure for a larger publication. But I think it's because of the nature of the conversations and the subject matter, it makes sense in that case. Um, and also, just to, like, I think, when I was starting out, it was much more in the personal essay realm. And
Mhm.
I think that was important to me to do because I wanted to show people that, again, I was not afraid to put myself out there, and be vulnerable, and to encourage
Hmm.
that in the people I was talking to also. So not just within the that conversation itself, but in the whole body of work, I was trying to kind of create this vibe of, this is a place where we come to, I feel like Nicole Kidman, a place where we come to feel the magic. But a place where we come to feel like it's a safe space, and you can share information. You can be vulnerable. You can talk through
Hmm.
stuff that maybe we don't always like to talk about, because I think that that's where we find some interesting commonalities, and where people can, read the piece and say, oh, someone else was going through this, and I feel like I can face that now too.
Totally, totally. That's really interesting. I feel like it makes sense to me, like, obviously for writing like a travel piece, like five pizza places to check out, you're like, I don't need to bare my soul to get the info I need for this.
Yeah.
But especially when you're talking about, like you said earlier, more vulnerable topics, um, kind of being able to give what you want to get uh,
Mhm.
makes sense to me. Do you have any kind of memorable interviews you've done for Queering the Burbs or other tips on kind of interviewing around vulnerable topics that come to mind?
Uh, yeah, I mean, some of the more vulnerable conversations I've had for Querying the Burbs, I think it's, in this case, I'm interviewing a lot of the folks I interview are people I know also outside of just, it's not like they're a stranger. So it's
Yeah.
about finding the right time and finding the right setting and circumstance. One interview I did a couple of years ago, I just remember we both were crying through a lot of it, but it was a very like intense moment in, I don't remember what was going on politically at the time, but it was, there's so much happening. It's hard to keep track
Yeah.
now. But some calamity was unfolding, and we were just talking about, um, what she had been up to and what I'd been up to. And it was a very vulnerable conversation, but I made sure it was a day when that was the main thing I was doing. We did it in her home because I knew that's where she'd feel most comfortable. We shared lunch.
Yeah.
So it's just like, um, when it's going to be a heavy conversation, anything you can do to make it a little cozier. I think in person is often better.
Hmm.
Or if you have the option of Zoom versus phone. Also, it might depend on that person's preference, whatever they're most comfortable with.
Yeah.
um, but just being maybe a little more flexible, and a little more of the hand holding than you normally would, and just trying to create as comfortable of an environment as possible,
Hmm.
when it's going to be getting into it, and just making sure the timing's right. um, if you can do
Yeah.
some pre-interviews maybe with someone that you don't know, and just have
Hmm.
conversations where nothing's being recorded, but just to have that person get to trust you a bit more and get to know you a bit more, I think is important.
Hmm.
um because it's crazy to think you would just hop on the phone with someone and instantly ask them about their deepest darkest experiences in life. And it's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
I don't know you, why are you asking me that? Yeah. So that's a tough nut to crack, though, and I think it does take some experience to get good at that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's almost like not only the art of interviewing and building connection, but like almost the art of having deep conversations in a way. Like, how do we get to this point where we both feel comfortable having this really deep conversation that, like, maybe I'm comfortable with a friend I've had for 10 years, but like we're doing this and maybe we just met. I don't have a solid question out of this. I'm just kind of reflecting back what I'm hearing from you and musing. But I think that is interesting because I think especially early interviewing, the thought is, oh, I just got my list, so I'm gonna go ask these questions. But when you're in spaces like you're talking about, it's like, okay, maybe this needs a little bit more thought and compassion to really get the meaty stuff that we want.
Mhm.
Um, anyways, um, back to you. You've clearly got a lot of wisdom around interviewing. You've interviewed in a lot of different contexts. I'd love to talk about what you mentioned at the top of the call, how you kind of would help teams get ready for big interviews. So talking about kind of managing writers and journalists, did you have any key pieces of advice that you would give younger writers and journalists around interviewing or anything that you would kind of frequently advise them on?
Um, I mean, I think it's one of those, it's kind of like riding a bike. It's like there's so many things you can say ahead of time, but I think you just kind of, it's one of those things you have to just do it and
Yeah.
kind of, you'll make the first pancake and you'll sweat through your t-shirt and and afterwards you'll hop off and go, what was that? Why did I do that? But you learn kind of as you do it. So my main tip would be just not to try to not be so nervous going into it because again, we are all humans and um, no one really knows what they're doing. So we're all just kind of feeling like imposters, probably a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Um, so just keeping that in mind, it's just like we're all people, no one's perfect. And just, try not to overthink it. You can
Yeah.
come in super prepared, have, you can control that part of it, and you can have confidence in your level of preparation. And then this other person is going to come into it with their own energy, their own agenda. And that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
It'll either be a great conversation, you'll get those great poll quotes, you'll get that great headline, you'll get the scoop, or maybe not so much, but it can't happen every time. So I think even the great interviewers, they don't always hit it out of the park. Um, so just I would yeah, I just would always tell the team not to be too nervous, to
Yeah.
just lean into their preparation and try and have a little bit of fun with it. Um,
Mhm.
Also, I think one thing that I've noticed sometimes folks forget to do is leaving space at the end of an interview. This is such a basic thing, but I think a lot of folks forget it is asking the person you're interviewing, is there anything else I didn't ask? Or is there anything else on
Mhm.
your mind or something else you wanted to share that we didn't get into?
Mhm.
Always having that space for folks, because I think it's easy again just to go down your list and think, okay, well, goodbye. But
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks getting interviews say, but wait, I didn't get a chance to clarify something. And a lot of times the best answer you'll get is that last answer.
Totally.
Um,
Sometimes I feel like it sparks a direction you weren't even thinking of, and they're like, "Oh, here's this like beautiful thought I had."
yeah.
Oh, great.
Well, and it takes some people longer to kind of warm up when you're talking to them.
Yeah.
So they may have just been building up something in their mind on the side from answering your questions that you had so dutifully prepared.
Yes.
Um, so then you say, hey, oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that. And that
Yeah.
happens so often, actually.
Yeah.
So it's really key.
Well, speaking of, I know we only have a few minutes. Is there anything else on your mind that I have not asked you about that you'd like to share?
No, I mean, I know we were chatting a bit before while setting this up about, you know, interview idols or interview icons. And
Yes.
I've gotten really into watching and listening to great interviews. And I'm not talking like Barbara Walters, but one of my favorite interviews in the game right now is Nardwar. Um,
Uh-huh.
he's,
Say more.
are you familiar?
I am not. No, I'm not hip to the culture.
So Nardwar is a Canadian kind of like punk rock icon who's been doing these like musician and pop culture interviews for decades now.
Uh-huh.
And you can pull him up on YouTube, and always just he's one of those people that he or his team, I'm not sure exactly how he does it, but
Yeah.
he comes in so creepily prepared, like FBI levels of information, um, where he really disarms his guests. And I always just really enjoy watching his interview style. So that's someone I go to for inspiration sometimes. And then also someone else who really inspires me with their interview style is the drag queen Delta Work.
Uh-huh.
Um, she was on RuPaul's Drag Race several years ago, but she now has a luxury public access talk show and podcast, is I think how she
Ooh,
exactly describes it,
amazing.
called I don't remember the name of the show. Okay, it's just Delta Work. Look it up on YouTube, you'll find it.
Yeah.
Um, and she brings on the most interesting people, and her interviews are so fun to watch. She actually, in addition to being a drag queen, has a journalism degree. So,
Amazing.
um, highly recommend Nardwar and Delta Work as two of my interviewing icons for folks who are listening to this to check out.
Awesome. I will definitely add those to the list to check out. That sounds great. Cool. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining me today. I loved hearing about all of your experience, your hot tips, also your nice stories. Those were really fun. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, anytime.
Cool.